Greetings, Type.World. I hope you all saw my previous video explaining Type.World in very broad terms as a conversation between me and Bill, a fictional Type Foundry representative. Bill didn't understand why a technology like Type.World is necessary, and I went to great lengths to explain to him why I believe Type.World will offer a vastly superior user experience for font users. This time around, and since we're in a Type Technology Meetup, I'd like to delve more into the technical details. I promise I'll try to keep it simple. I set out to find the answer to the question, how do I make it possible to install fonts from the internet onto a computer in an automated fashion? For security reasons, you can't push files from the internet onto a computer's file system. That would be very dangerous, as it would open the floodgates for all kinds of malware to enter. The same goes for browsers. They do have access to the file system, but that access isn't granted to a website that's loaded in the browser. From a website, you can only access a very limited set of features of the computer, such as the camera or microphone for video calls, or the computer's location. But for files such as fonts that need to go into the operating system's font folder, that's not possible and likely never will. What it needs is an entirely separate app that a user installs once. This app will communicate with different servers and pull the fonts from the internet onto the file system from the inside. When you tell a browser to load a page of a website from a server, it typically receives HTML data back. That page can be static, which means its content is defined in an HTML file on the web server and doesn't usually change. Or it can be dynamic, which means that its content is generated on the fly by a server-side program to suit the user, usually identified by being logged into the website. In case of a Type Foundry that you purchased fonts from, one example of a dynamic page is the user account section where you get to download the fonts that you've purchased. Note that you don't get access to all the publisher's fonts, but only to those that you are entitled to use. That page's HTML content is dynamically created to suit yourself as the publisher's customer. Type.World functions similarly. Instead of HTML, it speaks a language called JSON, which is a very simple and popular data exchange format. In our case, I have defined what content that JSON data needs to hold. It's called the Type.World JSON protocol. It contains all the data that's necessary to display the fonts that you're entitled to install from a certain publisher and install them on request. That data I call subscription. Don't confuse that with a commercial definition of subscription as a recurring payment for a recurring service. In our case, think of subscription in a technical way. Access to a certain set of fonts. Those fonts in the subscription could change. Imagine that you buy more fonts from the same publisher, or imagine that the fonts you're using from that publisher receive an update. With Type.World, you subscribe to those changes on a technical level. The JSON subscriptions are served by the very same web server that you've purchased the fonts from, only in a different place on that server. They both connect to the same database. That place is called an API endpoint. API stands for Application Programming Interface, and it means that programs such as the Type.World app can talk to the Foundry's server about stuff, in this case about fonts, and the language they both need to speak is the Type.World JSON protocol. How the fonts get into the subscription, by the way, is not Type.World's concern. Take this as a reminder that Type.World does not get itself involved in selling fonts. It only makes fonts available to install. The first time you as a user access such a subscription will probably be on the Foundry's website. After you've purchased a font from a Foundry that supports Type.World, you will see a button that may look like this. You click the button and open comes the Type.World app, which loads the subscription and displays the content for your review. Note that you will have to have downloaded and installed the app once prior to that. The button you click carries a hidden link that uniquely identifies a certain Type.World subscription. This is how the link normally looks, and it consists of a few different parts. The first part is a handler for the operating system to know that the Type.World app should be opened. The second part points to the aforementioned Type.World JSON protocol. It's the only protocol that exists at the moment, but more could be added in the future, so we're putting that into the link. Next comes the transport protocol, HTTPS, which provides securely encrypted traffic. Note that the transport protocol doesn't contain a colon before the two slashes here because any link is only allowed to carry one : / sequence, which the resource handler at the beginning already uses. The subscription ID uniquely identifies you as a user with the Foundry through an anonymous string. This is how the web server knows which fonts to offer to you. And finally, the URL of the so-called API endpoint that generates the JSON responses on request. Combined with the transport protocol, the actual web URL of that API endpoint is https://awesomefonts.com/API. So the Font Foundry's web server creates these subscriptions dynamically for each user, like the download web page already does. What's important to know is that these subscriptions only hold metadata, that is, data about the fonts, not the actual fonts yet. Once you receive the subscription in the app and decide which of the fonts you want to install, the app requests them from the Foundry's web server in a second step and installs them in the operating system. The Foundry server retains full control over which fonts to serve to whom. If you've purchased a 5-seat license for a font, it's very likely that you can then only install it on up to 5 different computers. Because the Foundry can monitor their font installations through the API, they are likely to restrict downloads beyond the user's license. If the user runs out of seats, a neat button in the app will send them back to the Foundry's shop to purchase a license upgrade. All this is important because the user can load a subscription on more than one computer. First, they can synchronize their Type.World user account between several computers of their own. Think of a desktop computer at work and a notebook at home. And second, they can invite other Type.World users to share their subscription, such as their colleagues in the office. Whether or not they are legally allowed to share subscriptions and with whom is not the concern of the Type.World app. That's a purely legal concern between the Foundry and the user, as it has always been. But because around 5 seats are the norm for desktop fonts, that invitation functionality must exist. The concept of invitations also extends to inviting external service providers to share fonts for a limited period of time. Each inviter can recall the invitation at any time, upon which the fonts get deleted from the invitee's computer. Now, remember that subscriptions are only metadata at first, not actual fonts. So you're really inviting someone to share metadata. The invitee's Type.World app then needs to request the fonts separately from the Foundry's API endpoint, and the Foundry still gets to decide whether to serve the fonts or not. So sharing a subscription is not an indicator about whether the invitee will actually get to see the fonts. The server retains full control. Let's take a quick look at the API endpoint. The Type.World JSON protocol defines 4 commands that the server needs to react to. The endpoint command contains publicly readable metadata about your server, such as your Foundry's name, website, logo, etc., and under which copyright license you decide to publish the metadata of your API endpoint. The default license chosen here, the Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives license, is defined in a machine-readable way and means that only uncommercial software may access your API endpoint. A commercial software needs to have a separate agreement with you or otherwise reject access to your API endpoint. The installable fonts command lists all the fonts that are available for a user to install as metadata. This is the essential data that normally constitutes a subscription. As we've discussed before, this is normally dynamically created content. The install fonts command is returned when the app asks to install the actual font files. Protected fonts will be shipped inside the response as base64 encoded strings, but for free fonts they could also be defined as URLs pointing to publicly accessible files on a web server. And finally, the uninstall fonts command doesn't return any useful data, but it's used to notify the API endpoint of uninstallations of fonts in the Type.World app in case the API endpoint wants to track installations of fonts. Friends, I've skipped a lot of details of the protocol and the whole ecosystem, but my time here is already up. I invite you to continue to read the developer docs at type.world/developer if you want to make yourself familiar with the service on a technical level. The project is still in beta. I hope to publish the first version end of March, though I have to admit that it sounds very ambitious at the moment. You can support me by becoming a patron on patreon.com/typeworld and by convincing your colleagues and favorite font foundries to support Type.World after it's been formally published. Don't forget to follow Type.World on Twitter. And a big thanks to TypeTech Meetup for hosting us here today.